Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, an anxious man becomes convinced that his apartment is haunted in the Shudder original, Night's End. Agoraphobic divorced father Ken Barber, played by Geno Walker, has moved into a new apartment where he spends his time making YouTube videos and taxidermy on birds. When one of his birds falls on its own during one of his videos, Ken starts delving into the history of his apartment, learning it is where a woman named Roberta Wellwood, played by Morgan S. Reach, tried to kill her father with an axe. As more supernatural incidents occur that he captures on video, his solitary life begins to become a personal hell. Night's End is a Shudder original directed by Chicago-based filmmaker Jennifer Reeder, who started out as a performance artist. She was White Trash Girl back in the 90s, and then she pivoted into directing, starting off with some shorts, and then to full-length features like LGBT wrestling rom-com Cincture Move, and the mystery drama Knives and Skin. But most recently, Reeder has pivoted into doing horror movies for Shudder. She directed the wraparound segments for the anthology movie VHS 94 for them, and that was directed under COVID. And the same is true of Night's End, which is very obvious from the fact that the entire movie largely takes place in one apartment with one major actor on set and the rest of the supporting cast all appearing on video calls. So Reeder has definitely been keeping herself busy over the last few years, but the question about Night's End is it enough to actually sustain a feature, or should it have been a short in something like VHS? Night's End is at its most promising in its very early stages because it has a fairly intriguing setup. When we first meet Ken at the beginning of this movie, it's clear that while he hasn't been in his apartment for very long, he already has a routine set up. Before he even gets out of bed, he starts counting up to 10 to try and soothe his anxieties, and it's blatantly obvious that Ken's every action and every movement is an attempt to try and soothe those fears within him. When he steps out into his kitchen, not only does he make his regular routine of coffee mixed heavily with Pepto-Bismol, but the camera lingers on the contents of his cupboards where everything is individually labelled. Everything in his apartment is an attempt to try and control his world. So when he steps out of the kitchen, he starts trying to water his plants. He starts going outside just briefly to try and pick up birds being sent through the letterbox that he'll use for taxidermy. And he'll make YouTube videos in an attempt to try and make some money off of it, although the fact that he's getting 11 viewers suggests that he's not really having much success. But the problem is that his apartment is his entire world. He is afraid of stepping outside, as exhibited by the fact that he actually blocks out the entire outside world. He has newspaper all over his windows. This is an extremely introverted existence, and it's obvious that something has happened to Ken in his past, that he has obviously had some form of mental health problems and he's trying to find his way back onto his feet. But the fact that he's in a new city, in a new apartment, all on his lonesome, suggests that hasn't been going as well as might have been hoped. Geno Walker's performance here is actually very impressive because he has to carry the vast majority of the movie. He is on screen almost the entire time, and this is a great showcase for Walker, who up until this point has only done guest spots on various TV shows, but this is his first lead role in a film, let alone the fact that he has to carry 90% of it all on his lonesome. And I think that he makes Ken as a character very engaging and someone that the audience can root for. We want to see him overcome his neuroses and anxieties and improve as a person and in his confidence. We want to see him succeed, but there's also a lot of very finely nuanced character work that I think that Walker puts into the character, and really can be seen because we spend so much time with him over the course of the film. So I think that Walker manages to make the character very affable in some way, despite the fact that clearly he has a lot of mental problems that he has to deal with. I do think that Walker actually shows a lot of potential in this role, and I think that I was particularly impressed later in the movie when the character starts to really be overcome by his own fears. And that's what hooked me in the early stages. It felt like the horror elements were supposed to be metaphorical, that they were more extensions of Ken's own distressed mental state, that the ghosts were almost a personification of his fears and anxieties. And it starts out very small. In the background of one of his videos, one of his taxidermy birds simply seems to gently move by itself and then flop off a shelf. It's a tiny but weird thing, but he becomes fixated on it. And then he starts trying to look into any kind of supernatural history with the apartment and its history, and he discovers this attempted axe murder, and the woman threw herself out of the window. Maybe she's the one that knocked the bird off. Maybe she is roaming around his apartment in some way. And so that becomes an obsession for him. He starts pivoting his YouTube channel into becoming a ghost diary of all these various encounters and trying to find the history of it and capture the ghost. And the more he does that, the more it feels like his mental state starts to unravel, in that this place that he's built in this very ordered fashion, this very safe space for him, this sanctum, becomes disrupted. It suddenly becomes this really terrifying place where he has these encounters that become more intense and more threatening. And because we don't entirely trust his point of view, we're not entirely sure what we're seeing is actually real or more just the process of his imagination. It becomes almost kind of nightmarish. And Reader does this very effectively, partially because of very intelligent use of the aspect ratio. You'll probably have already noticed that Night's End has a very narrow aspect ratio of roughly around 255, and that's extremely deliberate. It's an aspect ratio that is both wide and claustrophobic simultaneously. So yes, we do feel like we're hemmed in with Ken in this one apartment that virtually the entire film is set in, but also it feels very expansive. It makes the apartment feel huge, and that means that there is a lot more room to actually place scares all around the frame. So you have our central focus on Ken maybe in the center of frame as he's talking to camera like I am right now. And yes, I am aware of the irony of me talking about a movie where the main character makes YouTube videos, but he's talking to camera like I am. And maybe there'll be some action on the extreme end of the frame that just really catches your eye and unsettles you. And it's those kind of traditional techniques that I think Reader shows an understanding of how horror works. A lot of the horror in Night's End does actually tend to be quite subtle, but there are some bigger, more elaborate moments. I was actually caught out by a jump scare in this movie, and that doesn't happen very often. There's a great moment very early into the film where he tries to go towards a door, and then suddenly a hand creeps out. And again, that seems to be a metaphor for Ken's condition. He's extremely agoraphobic, so stepping past the front door of his apartment, let alone the apartment complex, is something that he struggles with. So it does feel like doors are a very deliberate motif in a lot of the scare sequences, particularly in one halfway through the movie where he's in his bedroom and he's being tormented by two different doors shaking with lights behind them. That sequence again seems to suggest that he's both terrified of being trapped but also terrified of what's beyond those doors in the first place. So that seemed to be where the movie was heading. A lot of movies that were set during COVID feel like they were very deliberately small, which is understandable because 2 years ago we were wondering how people were going to make films at all, and certainly a lot of movies are coming out now that were made during that period of time where it does feel like the filmmakers kept their ambitions very limited, but that makes for a very disappointing experience because it feels like the ideas are not enough to carry a 90-minute feature. And it does feel like in this case, the same thing is happening here. I do feel like Night's End kind of reaches its apex about 45 minutes in, and there's still another 40 or so minutes to go. But the movie really doesn't make the most of the ideas that it sets up either. Take the taxidermy thing, for example. That's a very prominent part of the movie early on, especially because it reinforces the theme that Ken likes order and control in his life. As he mentions, Ken's father liked living birds, but he prefers dead birds because they make much less noise. And I think the filmmakers have only included taxidermy in the movie because they know it's a creepy hobby, that it's in some way unsettling for the audience to watch, that maybe it indicates that there's something off about Ken in some way. And that might be fine if they actually did anything with that. Aside from a couple of instances where his birds move on their own, there'll be a jump scare and suddenly they've moved onto his laptop, the movie doesn't really do anything with that idea. It doesn't really follow through on trying to connect that into the growing narrative like you think it might do very early on, like there might be some kind of sting in the tail in some way. But no, it's just an idea that kind of falls through the cracks, and it feels like the only reason that something like that is in the movie is because, hey, it looks a little bit unsettling seeing taxidermied birds. And the YouTube angle is similarly underdeveloped. The movie sets up this idea that he creates this ghost diary channel, but aside from him creating a couple of vlogs that we see clips of, we never see the interactions of the actual channel itself. We don't see it grow in likes and subscribes, and we don't see the comments pouring in and them increasingly wondering whether it's a hoax or not. These are all things that are mentioned in the dialogue, but we don't actually get to see them, and it feels like a major missed opportunity in the movie because, again, it would have reinforced this idea that Ken is making this YouTube channel more as a sense of validation for himself, and it's again a further outlet to the outside world. So having those comments come in and shake his confidence, especially because what's happening to him feels so real, again, that could have been moved into a potential area of commentary about how YouTube potentially, as a platform, allows creators who may be potentially vulnerable to put themselves out there but not have the ability to be able to cope with that. That could have been something that the movie engaged with and put into its horror. And so the problem with the movie isn't that it's largely just one actor for the majority of the running time. The problem is that it feels like the story ideas are not entirely thought through in the first place. But instead of substance, in their place is endless video calls. Sometimes these can be effective. The movie does have a vein of dark comedy running through it, so these calls do provide a welcome outlet of humour between the scare sequences. This is most keenly felt in the interactions that Ken has with his friend Terry, played by Felonious Munk, who tries to push him with his YouTube channel in a more supernatural direction, try and get the attention of a big YouTuber named Dark Corners, get included in one of his compilations, maybe make his channel big that way. But he's also the one that has the most kind of realistic interactions with him, where if something happens to Ken during the call, he's kind of unsettled by it and grossed out by it. But Munk provides a welcome bit of humour through the movie. Kate Arrington, playing Ken's ex-wife, also I think provides some dramatic grounding for him, and definitely the humour is most keenly felt in the guest appearance of Michael Shannon. I'm not quite sure why Michael Shannon is in this movie. He's by far the biggest name in it, and it's literally a bit part in the movie. He's playing Ken's ex-wife's new partner, and he just walks into the movie basically seemingly as a favour almost. I know that Shannon is a Chicago native, so obviously he knows the filmmakers, and it's clear that his appearance is meant to be a joke in of itself, because Shannon is known for playing these really intense characters, whereas here, his character is really happy-go-lucky. He's just a really pleasant, affable guy that likes wearing garish Hawaiian shirts. The contrast is the humour in of itself. My problem with the video calls, though, isn't just because I've seen a lot of COVID films where video calls dominate the running time, and sometimes that can be handled gracefully. Language Lessons is literally an entire movie of video calls, and that is incredibly charming. But here, they reinforce the fact that there isn't all that much substance going on in the movie. If anything, it reinforces how little actually happens in it, because the calls go on and on and on, and it's clear that they're only there to pad out the running time so that we can get it past the 80-minute mark of being a feature. So these calls have characters talking about things that we've already seen or are seeing right in that present moment. It doesn't feel like enough is actually being driven forward in those conversations. It just feels like it's on screen because they need something to fill the space. And that is genuinely unfortunate. It does feel like the movie loses a lot of the momentum that it builds up early on, because halfway through you start to realise that the pacing has completely disappeared in all this. Any of the horror elements start to fade into the background, and the more that Night's End goes on, the more it seems to be turning into a different kind of movie, especially as the focus starts to shift onto a mysterious supernatural expert played wonderfully by Lawrence Grimm, who definitely leans into the campier aspects of that character. But that feels like a very different direction than what we started off as, which is this very intimate chamber piece focused on the character of Ken. And going into the movie's third act, it actually feels like Ken is a bit player in his own movie to a certain extent. And the more the film progresses, you start to realise that what you actually thought was meant to be allegorical was supposed to be perceived literally, especially with the way the plotting goes. And by the time of the big finale, which is this live-streamed YouTube exorcism, it becomes this wild and crazy movie. Certainly, it's a very memorable finale, and definitely some outrageous things happen in it as it pans out. But again, I felt like as I was watching it, it didn't feel like the conclusion to the movie that had been set up at the start of it. It feels like we're watching suddenly a totally different film in terms of tone and approach, and it actually feels like this last segment of the movie could have honestly been a segment in a VHS anthology movie or the like, because it feels that detached from what's going on in the first 45 minutes of it. And the movie tries to recover very late in the game, right before the credits. It tries an attempt to bring it back round to Ken's story, but by that point, it's too late. Not just because so much is happening at the very conclusion of this movie that the story has gone far beyond Ken, to the point where his personal struggles seem very minor by comparison, but also it doesn't feel earned. And if anything, those final moments feel very thematically confused. I'm not sure how I was supposed to feel about Ken in that particular moment, or why I should care about him given what happened at the very, very final moments of this movie. Night's End is a real oddity. It feels like a halfway house between a more thoughtful, introspective horror film and a punk rock schlockfest. And those are two perfectly fine genre approaches, but they're not cross-compatible with each other, and I don't think those are two audiences that are really gonna appreciate the movie either way, because those drawn in by the former will be left cold by the conclusion, and those that like their horror a bit more outrageous will find the first hour of the movie far too conservative. So Jennifer Reeder does do a fairly good job of helming the scare sequences, and there are potentially intriguing ideas here, but there's just simply not enough actually in the story of the film, especially not enough to sustain feature length. If you like this review and you want to support my work, then you can buy me a Ko-fi, hopefully without any Pepto-Bismol, or you can summon away dark forces with my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.